Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Novomikhailivka, where we see the Russian forces launch yet another attack to the south of the city, and the Russian forces managed to gain further control over the forest lines here to the southwest of it, and they managed to regain a foothold here in the farm areas to the south of the city. So we're seeing that the Russian forces are attempting multiple strikes towards the south of it, trying to gain further control over the areas and push the Ukrainians out of it, while heavy fighting takes place as the Ukrainian forces are standing their ground and are hoping to prevent further Russian advances in the area. So we're seeing a lot of fighting here in the direction of Novomikhailivka, which is centered about the Russian forces launching armored assaults and small assault groups with infantry, while the Ukrainian forces are holding up their locations by using armored vehicles at the edges of the city, as we see the Ukrainian forces positioning themselves throughout the southern parts of it to try and deal with the Russian forces. And the Russian forces are trying to concentrate their units in specific areas to gain advancements there. We also see Russian forces launch artillery strikes as well as heavy bombardments with the FABs on the Ukrainian targets, attempting to destroy them before they are able to face off against the Russian forces. So seeing heavy fighting taking place in the Novomikhailivka direction, and subsequently the Russian advances that comes along with it. We then move further north in the direction of Pobeda, where we have this geolocated footage which shows a Russian FAB strike within the northernmost outskirts of the village. So we're seeing that the Ukrainian forces are being hit by FABs everywhere on the front line, really, not just Novomikhailivka and Pobeda, and fighting continues in this direction, similar to how we saw that the Russian forces managed to capture the westernmost outskirts of Marinka, getting 100% of the village under their control. And now we're seeing that they are fighting further westwards in the direction of Heroivka, where we've been receiving reports of them advancing westward of Marinka and entering Heroivka both in the north and the south. However, there's been no confirmation so far. So we move on to the direction of Orelivka, where we see that the Russian forces bombard Ukrainian forces attempting to strike the Russian positions here by the west of Orelivka. We see continuous attempts by the Ukrainian forces to gain a foothold here by the heights and the waste heaps here to the west of Orelivka, but we see that the Russian forces are bombarding those Ukrainian assault groups and are holding their ground and fortifications here to the west of Orelivka. So there's a lot of fighting here as well, although it is less important and less significant than the fighting taking place in Avdiivka, where we're seeing that the Ukrainian forces launched a counterattack and have managed to reach positions here to the south of Stepove in the forest lines, as is shown with this geolocated image here. We saw that Ukrainian soldiers managed to reach the forest line and were subsequently hit by Russian FPV drones, which means that the Ukrainian forces have managed to regain control over the forest line here. So we're going to see further territorial changes in this direction. So we're seeing that a lot of fighting is taking place here, as well as the Ukrainian forces tried to disrupt the Russian advances in the northern flank of Avdiivka. We see that the fighting of Avdiivka is very tough and very heavy all across the front, and we subsequently have this interview / press conference where Zelensky said that he admitted to the loss of Marinka, saying that the Ukrainian forces withdrew out of the city and set off defensive positions outside of it, and then he admitted that Avdiivka will likely fall to the Russian hands within 2 to 3 months. So we are seeing that the outlook for the Ukrainians fighting in this direction isn't that positive, as the Russian forces continue bombarding their positions, sending reinforcements and launching new attacks all the time, while the Ukrainian forces are very limited in what they can send as additional supplies, as additional manpower to the front to deal with the Russian advances. And if the Russian forces manage to capture Avdiivka and putting it under their control, the city of Donetsk would be outside of the artillery range of the Ukrainian positions, and therefore we'll see a position where the Ukrainian forces will not be able to deal with the Russian supply situation in Donetsk, except with their HIMARS strikes, their multi-launch rocket systems, as well as their airstrikes, significantly limiting their capabilities to disrupt the Russian supply lines in the area, As such, we'll likely see further Russian advances and operations in the Donetsk direction due to additional supplies being able to be redirected to this area, allowing them to gain the upper hand throughout the front. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where there's been a lot of fighting. However, there's been no reported territorial advances over the past 24 hours. The fighting has extended from just Bohdanivka being the center of the fighting to now including all the way from Andriivka through Klishivka to the outskirts of Ivanivsk, now through the roads between Khomov and Chasiv Yar, Bohdanivka, and also Hryvorivka. So with this, the front line in Bakhmut has significantly extended from what it used to be. However, it will likely extend further to the direction of Orehovo-Vasilivka, Vinkivka, Privilya, to the north of Selesnyansk, northwest of Krasnopolivka towards Vasyukivka, and all throughout the whole front line. So we'll likely see that the Russian forces will send further reinforcements and increase their operations all throughout the front line from Berestove in the northeast and down south to Kurdyumivka, where we'll see continuous Russian operations to try and increase their zone of control, make a front line by the canal line that goes through the central part up to the north towards Slovyansk and through to the Severodonetsk River. So all of this fighting will likely take place throughout the front line, and the Russian forces will likely also look to fight in the direction of Siversk, but one thing at a time, and it is clear that they want their first step to be full control over Hryvorivka and down south through the canal line down to Kurdyumivka in their offensive operations in this direction. Somewhere else where we have a similar case is here in the north, to the northwest of Kreminna, as Russian forces yet again managed to advance in the direction of Terny. We've seen that they've managed to gain further positions by the forest lines getting a foothold in this dense forest area, as well as advancing further by the forest lines to the northeast of Terny. So with this, we see continuous advances by the Russian forces in this direction as they try to get the upper hand and achieve success in this direction. We also see that the Ukrainian forces, due to this continuous advancements by the Russian forces, launched a counterattack where they managed to hit some Russian positions and gain control over the forest areas here in the central parts, after which the Russian forces responding by sending FPV drones yet again to attack the Ukrainian positions. So we're seeing that whenever the Ukrainian forces launch counterattacks, they get heavily bombarded by FPV drones and artillery, and the Russian forces also get hit similarly by the Ukrainian forces. But again, the sheer amount of weapons the Russians have compared to the Ukrainians is so much more, and they have more manpower available right now. Therefore, the Russian forces are able to make advancements all throughout the front, and the Ukrainian forces are being heavily pressured in all directions. Something important to notice is that Shoigu recently announced in a press conference that the main goal of the Russian army through 2023 was to deal with the Ukrainian offensive. It is something that we noticed after the Ukrainian offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv. They managed to regain large amounts of land, and the Russian forces were humiliated and pushed back from multiple locations that they were holding, like Izium and Kherson. And as a result of that, the Russian forces moved to a defensive position where they had as their primary goal through 2023 to be able to deal with any Ukrainian offensive and to prevent further loss of territories similar to that of the Kherson and Kharkiv offensives of the Ukrainian army. And therefore we see that they have successfully met those expectations. They prevented a Ukrainian offensive, and now we are likely going to see a shift in the focus of the Russian army from a defensive nature to an offensive nature, as they want to gain further territorial controls so that they are able to negotiate a peace deal. And if that does not happen, if no peace deal is signed, then we'll likely see that the Russian forces will completely switch up their operations to something else, where they'll force the Ukrainians to capitulate rather than fight further for a signed peace. And that is where I'm going to end up this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.